Thank you, Michael. It's really an honor to be here. I want to thank also Laura Clay for arranging the visit. As Michael mentioned, we were teaching at Furman, which is a fairly similar liberal arts college for many, many years. And now we work at a think tank in Washington, D.C. It's a great job. We love it. But if there's one thing we miss, it's being in a room full of people just about your age. So this is great to be back here. We're very excited to present some old thoughts, some new thoughts, and to get your questions about what we say. So I want to talk about a class that we taught right before we left Furman. This was an engaged living course, so students applied to get into it before they came to campus, and they lived together and took a class in the fall from my husband and then in the spring from me. And because it was a special course, we were allowed to have TAs, which we don't usually have. We picked some senior students who we'd been working with for 4 years and found that this was a really great and new experience for us because those people had lots of questions about teaching that, we'd been doing this for a long time, but hadn't really reflected on and articulated exactly what it was we were doing. So I want to start with some of the questions they asked me and that I learned from. What was really on their mind at the beginning of the year was what habits and instincts to encourage in students and which to check, right? How do you know when students are on the right track and when they're on the wrong path? And it was really puzzling to them that I wasn't taking a lot of the outward signs of success as determinative of where those students are or where they might be in a few years. I was worried about students they thought you really didn't have to worry about. These were the kind of students who were hitting all the marks that seemed to be important, right? They would usually come sailing through the campus gates, having been festooned with honors even before they arrived. They were valedictorians, they were 3-sport athletes, they were skilled musicians. They were people who had invented things, they had founded clubs to deal with problems that we had hardly ever heard of. They were really impressive, and we loved having them in our class. At first, because we thought they didn't need a lot of our help, right? They were just gonna do fine and they were gonna be a joy to be with. And they were a joy to be with, but we found over the years that things often went downhill in ways we didn't expect. So these students would come to us, say, in the beginning of their time at Furman, and they would unfold these spreadsheets on our office desks where they had carefully planned out all the courses they were going to take over the course of their 4 years. I don't know if anyone does that in this room, but this became a little drill, right? And we were like, okay, and here's when I'm going abroad, and here are my internships, and then when I leave, this is what I'm going to do. Well, actually, I'm not sure. I think I want to go to law school, but maybe I'll be inspired and do a PhD first, right? And it was like law school, PhD, law. I'm like, we're playing between the 40-yard lines here. Like, it's going to be fine, right? But then they would come back, and sometime usually like the fall of their senior year, and the wheels would look like they were coming off. The old questions would come back, law school, PhD. But underneath those questions now churned a sea of anxiety and uncertainty and confusion. They weren't sure they had the energy to pursue either. Maybe they should just get away somewhere, they'd say. And I have to warn you, there's a program designed to hit precisely at these moments. It's called the Fulbright program. Teach English somewhere on the far side of the globe. Take a great vacation, escape it all, while avoiding that dreaded gap in the resume. Now, Fulbright's all right for some, but for many, they're like a crutch, I've found, sadly. And so I tried to deflect those students who really this wasn't really going to help them. I was trying to deflect them from taking that alternative. So then they'd cast about, I don't know, maybe I'll go back home. Maybe I'll open up a coffee shop. For some reason that was what they'd reach for. It's not because they'd been thinking about small business for the last 4 years or how to give back to a local community. It was a way of going dark to themselves. So eventually my husband and I wrote a book about this phenomenon. We called it Why We Are Restless. We chose that term restlessness to describe the predicament these students found themselves in. And we meant by it people that are full of activity but lacking in purposive action. They were very busy, right? They were doing lots of different things. Quite literally, they were sometimes sleepless. But they were just simply tired at the end of the day, rather than fulfilled. They had done it all just as they'd planned, But in the end, they weren't quite sure what it was they had done. We gave those students the term restless, and we tried to figure out exactly what was making them restless and what would help them out of that predicament. I think for a moment I should pause here, though, and say, as we were preparing for this lecture, someone at Villanova pointed out to me that you have a term used nowadays, rooted and restless, okay, and that it is maybe on banners all over campus or something like that. So I just want to distinguish what we're saying from what I imagine your administrators mean by restlessness. I'm guessing that they take that from an Augustinian sort of version of that term, right? So Augustine, as I'm sure you all know, quite famously said that his heart was restless until it found rest in God. That's not what we mean. On the surface, Augustine and our students might look somewhat similar. Augustine also had a pretty long, messy period in his life, but there's a key difference. At some point, Augustine became utterly determined, fanatically determined, to find out the truth and the best way of life. Yes, he tried lots of strange things in the process, but he never willingly let himself be dark to himself. So I've talked about the students from that first year class who had all those outward markers of success, but we were concerned had inward signs of future trouble. My TAs were equally surprised at my judgments of some of those not so apparently successful students. These were students who were awkward or clumsy, slightly disruptive maybe in class, not always doing the assignments as instructed. What on earth did I see in such young people? Why did I encourage their somewhat clumsy efforts? So in some of them, I detected a sort of Augustinian quality. When we talked about it, we came up with the term intellectual honesty. We thought that was the determining mark of people who actually found their way in college. So these students, what would they look like? They would typically tell us when their thoughts or desires didn't match up with the argument in the text. So I teach Plato's Republic. I'd be trying to relate the arguments that Socrates is making to Glaucon about how you should really pursue the just life. And they would say things like, well, I see the argument, but honestly, Dr. Storey, I want a Bugatti. And they just wouldn't end with that. Like, they would engage with my questions, like, what is a Bugatti? I had to ask. But then after that, why do you want that precisely? Why do you think that will make you happy? And they would be willing to talk about themselves, not as if they were posing for Instagram or writing something on Facebook to get likes, but they would truly tell us their messy longings. They'd write papers such as, I know Aquinas says everyone seeks the good, but what about people who want to commit suicide? Or, is boredom a good thing or not? In other words, risky papers, like papers where you were quite unsure that you would come to a clear answer. You might not get an A. In short, these students were those who wouldn't play the game when they weren't sure why the game was being played. Now, not all of those with some mark of budding intellectual honesty would succeed in developing it, of course. And not all of those who were succeeding by conventional standards were bound to flounder in their senior year. It's good news that intellectual honesty is something that can be learned, we found. Indeed, that it's something that has to be developed. But what was really shocking to us, and what caused us to write that last book, Why We Are Restless, was that spending 4 years in college wasn't reliably helping our most competent, best students develop that virtue of intellectual honesty. Indeed, those students who had done everything that the college had asked them to do were often those who were most directionless at the end. In other words, their liberal education had not served to make them more thoughtful and confident, but confused and restless.
So let me start by just adding my own word of thanks to you all for being here tonight. It really is fun to be back in a room full of 18 to 22-year-olds again. Although I can't resist indulging one of my old professorial habits and telling those of you who are on your phones to put them away. Oh, he's on his calculator. Okay. All right. So, how are the young taught to chart the course of their lives? We want to focus on two navigational devices, not including smartphones, that educational authorities of our time recommend to students as they're trying to figure out what to do with their lives. And those two navigational devices are, on the one hand, the checklist, and on the other, the inner voice. So first, the checklist. Checklists, as you all know, govern the academic life of American undergraduates in 2022 with a kind of astonishing minuteness. I was an academic advisor for 17 years, and when my fresh-faced newbies would arrive on campus for their first conversations with me, the first thing I would do is hand them a checklist. That checklist outlined the general education requirements that the university spelled out as the necessary hurdles to clear to get their liberal education. For those who continued on into the political science major, I taught in a department of political science, I had yet another checklist. This one spelling out the requirements for the degree of Bachelor of Arts in politics. And these two documents would govern my conversations with these students. Students typically like the checklists. They like them for a good reason. Checklists are orderly and rational. It's a nice way to chart one's progress through one's education. First year writing seminar, check. Intermediate Spanish, check. Politics 101, aha. I got that one before I even came to college by taking AP Government when I was in high school and getting a 5 on the exam. Moreover, it satisfies both a general education requirement and a major requirement. Double check. So students like the checklists because it's concrete documentation of their work and their progress. That may be one reason why double and triple majors seem to proliferate over my time in the academic world. Having an extra major or 2 or 3, or I met a guy a couple of weeks ago who had 4. Don't get ideas. What doing that does for people is it allows them to organize the entirety of their education in checklist form. Now, in my own undergraduate experience, I found that I wandered from one program of study to another, and I found that actually the most important courses I took were electives. That is, those courses that don't fit on any checklists. And I'll try to tell this to my students. And most of them look at me like that doesn't compute. And some of them look at me like I've just suggested going to a dive bar. Because there's something sort of indecent in their minds about doing something, investing time on something that whose utility cannot be quantified in this way. So some of my students liked checklists so much that they didn't see any reason to confine them to academic life, and they deployed them in their personal lives as well, including on subjects as intimate as dating or finding a spouse. Tall? Check. Handsome? Check. Likely to make a good living? Check. Religious? Needs further investigation. Question mark. So here's the problem. In spite of the satisfactions of the checklist, and I'll give you a little confession. My wife is a great maker of lists. And the good ship Storey would sink without them. In spite of the importance of the list, there's a problem with organizing your education by checklist. And that problem is that the lists don't measure what they purport to measure. They're disconnected from their aim. So here, let me explain what I mean. What does the General Education Requirements Checklist claim to measure? Claims to measure liberal education. Now, ask yourself, does doing the stuff that it takes to fill in those boxes, like sitting through your courses or passing a multiple choice exam, does that actually make you more like liberal education's greatest exemplars? People like Martin Luther King or Socrates? Plainly, it does not. And in fact, there might actually be kind of an inverse correlation between the willingness to go through these box-checking exercises and being like those people. Because Socrates and Martin Luther King were two people who were defined by the unwillingness to play games of which they did not understand the point. So, educational authorities know that checklists are not enough. And so they supplement the checklist with a second navigational device, the inner voice. The inner voice is supposed to provide a sort of a warmer, a more personal, a more quirky and independent way of orienting yourself through college and through life. So if you're like me, at some point in your education, an authority, a teacher, a professor, a guidance counselor, an academic advisor has said to you, while you're in the course of a conversation about what you want to do with your life, that is a question only you can answer. You need to follow your own star. You need to be true to your authentic self. You need to express the real you. The cliches pile up like jackknifed tractor trailers on I-95. So the inner voice appears as a kind of emotional divine command, a deep and assured summons that draws us toward a life that suits us, like the muse evoked by the poets as the source of their songs. And I think educational authorities refer to it because they want to express to the young that they respect their individuality, right? That they're going to let them chart their own course. But I made this disturbing discovery over the course of my own education, which is that when I did some of that inward listening that people kept telling me to do, I couldn't hear the inner voice. I was a very confused young man. I was a terrible high school student, and I have lots of follies I could tell you about over drinks. And as somebody confused like this, I would have welcomed a divine command, speaking authoritatively from within me and telling me what to do with my life. But when I listened to what was going on inside, what I found was that I had longings and I had questions, but I did not have any command. This piece of essential navigational equipment, which was supposed to be installed at the factory, was just missing on the model of the human person behind the wheel of which I found myself. So in my conversations with students, I've discovered that some of them claim to hear the inner voice, and that those inner voices often express themselves in some surprisingly conventional ways. I've always just wanted to be an international human rights lawyer. But others who are more like me, they just don't hear it. They don't experience any romantic summons to become a this or a that. When they make this discovery, some of them decide just to fake it. I have a deep and inexplicable attraction to venture capital. But others start to ask some probing questions of their education. What might I find on this campus that can actually help me figure out what I want to do with my life? So I think the problem with education oriented by the checklist on the one hand and the inner voice on the other is that these two devices separate reason on the one hand and longing on the other into separate compartments. So the checklist makes academic life look orderly and progressive, but it doesn't have any essential relation to human aspirations. It doesn't have any energy, right? Like, you got to go through all these boxes, but something's got to pull you through. And the checklist doesn't tell you anything about that something, that energy that is supposed to be guiding your life. Where inner voices, on the other hand, are supposed to be idiosyncratic oracles, like your own personal priestess at Delphi. And the point of them is that you can't reason with them. Their commands are beyond question. So the ideal version of this model of thinking about yourself, this model of trying to make your way through education and life, would be to have your reason create a checklist to execute the plan indicated by your inner voice's firm command. But if you notice, the ultimate aims of such a life are still arbitrary. And one wonders, is this really how it has to be? That the best life is a kind of slavery to one's own whims, to which reason can never be anything more than a dull, if effective, servant. So this combination of reason reduced to a desiccated box checker and longing understood as an inscrutable summons stands, we think, in the way of the kind of conversation in which liberal education should consist.
Okay. So if we're saying that liberal education should consist in or provoke a conversation between your reason and your longings, what do we mean by that? So first, we mean to claim that your longings can talk to reason, and indeed that your longings have reasons of their own. And on the other hand, that your reason can converse with longing because reason has longings of its own. In other words, longing has an intellectual component or aspect, and reason itself has a desiring quality. We want to know. And furthermore, the amazing thing is that when you get your reason and your longings talking to each other, a new part of your soul emerges into view. Now, this is a part of the soul that we don't often see or listen to any longer. We're going to call it, following Aristotle, desiring mind, or minded desire. It's intellect marked with longing, or longing marked by intellect. Okay, that's the theoretical part. How do you learn to see that part of the soul that we're speaking of, though? The best way really is to take your longings seriously, and then get them to speak in terms that your reason can understand. Ask, why precisely do I seem to want that? So let me start with one of the most basic longings that students usually have when they go to college. And indeed, that's usually how I start many of my initial classes. I ask some poor student in the audience, why do you want to be here? Why are you here?
Because attendance is required.
Oh, all right. But why are you fulfilling these requirements?
Because it's a graduation requirement.
Okay, why do you want to graduate? Why do you care about that?
Because I need a college degree.
Why do you need a college degree?
Because I want a job.
Ah. So why do you want a job?
Money.
That's usually what it comes down to. There's more, you could go further, but it reminds me of something I heard from a professor friend recently who was talking with a student, I think it was after maybe a commencement address by a dean or something like this, who was encouraging the students to use the 4 years of their college time to try to figure out the meaning of life. And that student went up to my professor friend, and my professor friend said, so what do you think about that? And that student said, well, Dr. Such and Such, to be honest, I don't want meaning out of this experience. I want money. I don't want meaning, I want money. I've heard from others, it's becoming like a popular phrase among students who are kind of sick of the wishy-washy talk. And yeah, it seems like a sensible longing, right? Money is solid. It's hard-headed and rational, reasonable to want it. Or is it? Let's let reason converse with this longing. Will money make you happy? Yes, comes the answer from a somewhat unlikely source, Thomas Aquinas. But only in a certain way and to a certain extent, he adds. Money, of course, can't itself be enjoyed, but it is useful, right? It can be traded in for lots of things that you need and also things you want. So it can get you food and clothing and shelter, can get you that Bugatti, can get you a latte. Money can't be enjoyed directly in the way that those things can, but it is, to be honest, often necessary to enjoy things like that. Okay, I get it, says the student, but to be honest, I would enjoy having a pile of money. I would enjoy having a full bank account. This itself would give me pleasure. Okay, precisely, rationally, what is that pleasure? It's a comfort in knowing that if your car breaks down, you can buy another one. If your mother gets sick, you can care for her. And if none of these awful things happen, you can buy the next iPhone, or the new pocketbook, or next year's video game. You can go to Paris. You can go to Villanova. The precise pleasure of a full bank account is precisely the idea that it can turn into anything, right? But that means that money is not a solid good. It is a liquid good. It is flexible. It is protean. And that is what we like about it. So some people say money is power, but more accurately, money is possibility. Which means that money, logically, rationally, is not an end in itself. It can't make you happy. Now, it can be a means to things that might make you happy, but how would you know? The plain truth is that students who say, I don't want meaning out of this experience, I want money, can't avoid facing the question of meaning, because they have to find out at some point what it is they're going to trade their money in for. But what if you just let your reason relax in the middle of this conversation with longing and try to let yourself take money as an end? If you let money be your horizon, your main goal in life? What if you delight above all in the possibilities that money opens up? Possibility is wonderful. It includes almost everything. It excludes only one thing, which is actuality. In other words, those good things that you can enjoy only when you give up on other possibilities, like marriage, right? If you're going to marry someone, you have to give up the possibility of marrying lots of other people. So we all know someone who is addicted to possibility. Someone who is so preoccupied, for example, with money and the doors it can open, that they cease to see the actualities that are right before them. Usually their life starts to be tinged with a bit of gray. They become more concerned with providing for a family than actually being with that family sometimes. Instead, they seek out people who might help them make a deal or introduce a new opportunity. That's what the story of Midas is meant to express, right? Midas was someone who was so lucky that everything he touched turned to gold, including his daughter. So if you don't take your very understandable longing for money seriously, don't make that longing converse with reason, but rather assume that it's rational, this is where your longings will probably unwittingly lead you. But what about the reverse? Those times when you don't let your longings rule, but when you start to want something and then your reason steps in quickly to slap it down. Let's take this example. You're a very accomplished young woman. It's the spring of your senior year. You've gotten very good grades, and you're completing some of your last assignments in the campus coffee shop. When your eye catches some really cute guy across the way, talking to some friends. You get up after a while to go to coffee, and amazingly, he ends up right in line behind you. He starts up a conversation, just small talk, but it turns out you know someone in common. You order your coffee, and while you're waiting to have it arrive, you can't help but overhear his conversation with the lady at the counter. You like his voice. You wonder whether maybe you should follow up with that mutual acquaintance and get some more information. But wait, shouts your reason. I have a great job waiting for me halfway across the country. Why would I get tangled up in someone like this right now? What would Aquinas say? Go Don't lecture. You're supposed to laugh. That's a laugh.
We know him. He's a plant.
I think Aquinas would say, don't lecture your longings. Try to converse with them. What is it that precisely attracted you to this guy? Now, we know from experience in teaching that students today tend not to believe in love at first sight. But Shakespeare did, Jane Austen did, Plato did, the writers of the Gospels seem to, and those are wise people. So what precisely attracted you to that guy? Was it the way he combed his hair? Was it that he combed his hair? Was it the way he was talking to that lady at the counter, the stranger? Was it perhaps the way he was talking to his friends? Would you like to be talked to like that for the rest of your life? Maybe, that's going to turn out to be more important to you and to your happiness than the job you have that you thought you always wanted. But how can you tell? The only way to tell which of your longings are rational is to talk to those longings seriously and ask them questions. Start that conversation between reason and longing where each has its part. If you do, you'll find that, as Pascal says, the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know, or doesn't yet know, but can learn. Because sometimes it's very strange, but your longings do see first, and then sometimes your reason does. The funny thing about this engagement between the reason and the longing is that it actually makes reason more rational. Reason ceases to be satisfied by cheap checklists or by easy answers like, I just want to make money, but actually starts to be the guiding light for a quest to understand what would truly satisfy. Longings also become more themselves. They're no longer content to be whimsical expressions of an idiosyncratic oracle, which are, as my husband said, usually little more than echoes of convention. But they begin to effectively press you towards sometimes surprising explorations of where your heart leads. So when we get reason and longing to converse with each other, we discover a new part of the soul, the one that I called desiring mind or minded desire, after Aristotle. And it's a very important part. Aristotle says it's the part that leads the way. It's the part that chooses. It's the part that makes you who you are. Indeed, he says, it's the part that defines what it is to be human.
Okay, so this discussion so far, the conversation between reason and longing, might seem actually to be too much about who you really are. That is, it might seem to be too much about the self, narcissistic. But what about doing good for others? What about all the injustice in the world? Aren't I obliged to make the primary aim of my life not asking self-centered questions, but actively working in a rough world to try to help people and advance justice? Concerns like this are common on a college campus, and they should be, because justice is a fundamental political concern, as well as a profound personal aspiration. Find figures earnestly seeking after justice and righteousness in almost any religious and philosophic tradition. But even the noblest human longings, if not brought into conversation with reason in the way that my wife was describing, if not deepened and made more intelligent by the kind of questioning that is at the heart of liberal education, can, we think, lead us astray. So let me try to explain this proposition. I want to take a noble longing. I'm not questioning motives here, and try to demonstrate how such a longing, if left unexamined, can unhinge a life. Let's say you're an intelligent and driven young person who wants to advance justice in the world. So you spend your time in college and later on in professional school getting the credentials that you need to do the work that you imagine will allow you to best have an impact, to advance justice. And then through intense striving and climbing, you land the kind of professional perch that will actually allow you to do that, from which you can truly make an impact. Things are going well. You start to gain recognition for your work. People appreciate the vibrancy with which you do it and the concern you have for the causes that they also care about. Those people seek you out. They want to talk to you. They ask your advice. And along the way, you get married, start a family, and find a home in proximity to your parents. I know somebody who did exactly this. The results were a train wreck that surprised everyone who knew her. Some of her professional work actually did serious damage to vulnerable other people who stood in the way of her ideological commitments. The well-intentioned advice that she gave to people who came to her, it was terribly misguided and worked out in tragic ways for the people who listened to her. Her familial life was riven by conflict because she let ideological and political concerns have priority over the more intimate obligations of family. And the vibrancy that had marked her outward demeanor and made her an attractive person became tainted with a kind of bitterness. And then one day, she provoked universal astonishment by suddenly quitting the job she had worked so hard to acquire, that unique perch from which she could advance her vision of justice. She traded it in for a post at a profit-driven international corporation that offered her an ample salary and some cushy perks. In an instant, she adopted the very kind of life she had spent her career decrying as self-serving. So, what happened here? The person I'm describing, and I knew her pretty well, never brought her reason into conversation with her longings, some of which were, in fact, genuinely noble. She wanted to work for justice, but she never took the time to seriously ask just what justice is. And taking justice seriously is not a matter of dedicating one's energies to headline-grabbing causes. Taking justice seriously means actually understanding. Okay, taking justice seriously means actually understanding how to benefit other human beings, to concretely improve their lives. And to do that, you have to understand what is actually good for human beings. And that's not at all obvious. Failing to ask such questions, the person I'm describing pursued her desire to help others in a random, reactive kind of way. And she eventually got sick of inhabiting the identity she had worked so hard to craft for herself. And meanwhile, she also failed to interrogate her more personal longings, concerned with her own happiness. And that longing, as Aristotle teaches, is universal among human beings. Everyone pursues happiness, even those who strive to stifle the concern with self. So she let herself go dark to this part of herself. And unexamined and unrefined, that longing for her own happiness got stronger, but not higher. And it eventually expressed itself as the plain old love of money. Mind and desire were kept separate, and she was back at what is effectively square one of moral philosophy. When we fail to bring reason and longing into conversation with one another, when we don't rationally refine the aims of our longings and give our desire for understanding the time and resources it needs to advance, we might seek to help others, but we won't know how. Meanwhile, we'll pursue happiness, as all human beings necessarily do. But that pursuit will be disjointed and restless.
So, how can liberal education help you pursue a life that is not so restless, but more purposeful? You dropped that word.
Purposive.
Thank you. 2 practical suggestions to end our talk with. These you can structure an entire institution around or a program, but these are things you can also do yourself. Both are meant to speak to the part of your soul that is the desiring mind or the minded desire and call that forth. So the first strategy, ask, what is it that you really want to know with your life? Now, maybe when I asked that question, an answer popped immediately into your head. You know the question that drives you on, but maybe you don't. So how do you figure it out? Think of the remarks that anyone has made to you that stick in your mind. It could be something your mom always said, or your coach, your friend. What is it that you dwell on? When I'm working with students on this, I often ask them to show me their books. What passages have they underlined and double-starred? Why? What classes do you take? What people do you seek out? Usually, if you think about these things carefully and those experiences and words that have been very meaningful, you can start to chart a question from them. Because it is the fact that all of your inclinations are marked with intellect. So see if you can trace them and determine what it is that you want to devote your life to figuring out. It's actually a very good way to learn to make choices. You can choose not only classes on the basis of that, on that model, but you can also choose things like internships. You should always be writing, what is it that I want to know from this experience? In a certain way, you can choose the people you want to be among. What is this person, what is this friend, potential friend, what is that person going to teach me in a way, right? What is my relationship with that person going to teach me sometimes? It's not always just a direct expression, right? If you do this, we've found your path will become clearer to you. And why is that? Our great teacher, Leon Cass, used to say, a question is a form of desire. And it took me like decades to figure out what that meant, although it was one of those remarks that I loved, right? A question is a form of desire because a question takes your inchoate anxieties, longings, curiosities, fears, and puts them into a determinate shape. A question launches an investigation. It starts you on a trajectory. It sets you literally on a quest. So as I was mentioning, it's possible to make this a key feature of a program, and I heard earlier this morning that I guess Humanities says it's not a great books program, it's a great questions program or so. So this wasn't a paid announcement for Humanities, but I think it is an advertisement.
Dear, they are paying us.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, everything comes with a price for Dr. Tomko, I've seen. So yeah, I mean, that's great. At Chicago, where we studied and met, there was a program called Fundamentals, Issues in Text. And I don't know if you're aware of that program, but they would literally have students write a question statement when they were applying. And that they would, the students in that program would write things like, what is justice? Or what does it mean to be a good mother? Or why is wandering so pleasant? And then they would spend the next few years picking 6 books, I believe they chose, that they thought were good guides to that question. And so they wouldn't just have the question, but they would ask that question to those books, and they would listen to the books and the authors, and they would learn from them. And then every year at the end, they would rewrite their question statement till they got to their final year, and they wrote a paper based on the question. So again, if you can join the Humanities program, just do it that way. That's the easiest way. But if you don't, or if you just want to do this later in life, you can do it yourself. And I really encourage you to do that. The second strategy, ask yourself, who do you long to become with your life? What qualities of character are most important to you? Now note, this is not the question, what do you want to do with your life? Which you tend to reach for some cookie cutter answer that will like just shut your grandparents up, right? Like, oh yeah, doctor, they're going to make their way, it's going to be fine. No, it's kind of an answer that should provoke further questions. What kind of person do you want to be? So I'm going to close with a story of a student, one of those conventionally successful students actually, who luckily in, I think it was the middle of his sophomore year, realized that he might be on the wrong track, and who let this question, what kind of a person do you want to be, actually change the course of his life. Now this student seemed to everyone else on the right track. He was in fact on the fast track to a career. He was vacillating between, I think it was iBanking and defense consulting. And he had done internships in each. He was very good, very talented, and is very talented. But something in the experience of those internships made him unsure of his path, and he came to me and asked me what he should do. So I asked him, who is it that you long to become? What kind of person do you want to be? He paused for a minute, and then he said, I want to be a responsible person. So I said, why? And he said, well, my dad died when I was really young, and at first there was no one that could fill his shoes. There was no one that could take responsibility for me. Eventually, I found a coach, and I found some other father figures, but honestly, I'm not sure I can live up to their example. I really lacked a responsible person in my life for a long time. So then I said, well, why did you decide to go do iBanking this summer? And he said, well, actually, those guys seem like they can take a lot on. Right? They seem responsible, but I'm not sure this is exactly what I meant by responsibility. The really key thing about this student is that he didn't let himself go dark to himself in the pursuit of the seemingly very bright future. But he connected with the spark of intellectual honesty inside of him, and he changed his mind, and then he changed the course of his life. He looked all of a sudden with new eyes at his studies and the various other opportunities before him. And before long, he found a young woman, committed to her in marriage, committed to her church, converted, and now they think very responsibly, amazingly responsibly, about how they're going to raise their family. And they are only 22 and 23. I'm very impressed. He did get a good job. It's in journalism. And he's making steady progress in actually writing thoughtful, responsible, helpful stuff. This young man, we think, has done an excellent job of using his liberal education to make himself less restless and start his life out on the pointed quest.
Thank you.